sticks, long-haired weirdos, short-haired weirdos, vandals, hooligans.
The government, hug the government, love the government, hug the government, love the government, hug the
Welcome to The Politics Guys, a place for bipartisan, rational, and civil debate on American politics and policy. I'm Michael Baranowski, political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. With me today is my regular co-host, Cleveland area attorney and Republican factotum, Jay Carson. Good morning, Jay. How you doing?
Well, I'm better than a mayor of a sanctuary city welcoming a busload of illegal immigrants.
You did say you would work on that.
I did, yes.
I like it. Now, of course, I'm going to expect a new one every time we do the show. So
yes,
the pressure is on.
I will do my best to oblige.
Okay, well, we'll hold you to that. Well, of course, and that kind of leads us right into what we want to start talking about this week. There's so much going on in immigration, and so I think it's maybe the place to start is, President Trump is said to have been, and currently is, I guess, incensed at his administration's inability to slow what's really a pretty impressive surge of Central American asylum seekers at the border. And so this past week, he decided to, kind of clean house at the Department of Homeland Security. Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen, who was really never been a Trump favorite, was forced to resign. And then Trump also withdrew the nomination of Ron Vitiello, who was his nominee to lead the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE. And in both cases, it's clear that the president felt and actually said that he needed people who were willing to be tougher on immigration. And of course, Trump has always been an immigration hardliner, but he's been pushed even more in this direction by National Security Advisor John Bolton and especially by Senior Domestic Policy Advisor Stephen Miller. And I mean, it seems to me, Jay, that at least in part, the shakeup at DHS is a move to kind of de-Kellyize the department. Of course, John Kelly, who's a Marine general back in the days when Donald Trump loved generals, he was Trump's first DHS secretary. And then when he moved to become Trump's chief of staff, a lot of his people actually stayed in top agency positions. And of course, Nielsen moved up to run the agency. So before we get into all the other immigration stuff, and there's plenty of it, what do you make of this DHS shakeup thing? I mean, is it kind of a rearranging deck chairs on the immigration Titanic or what?
I think he's looking definitely for someone with more of a focus. The job of Homeland Security is a pretty broad one, right? And I think when that job was originally conceived, immigration wasn't one of the top responsibilities of that job, right? It was sort of coordinating these other agencies that would fight the war on terror. So there's. I mean, I think it's a little bit of a, square peg, round hole kind of thing. But because, terrorists could infiltrate across the border, Homeland Security sort of, necessarily has that sort of responsibility too. So I think, look, it's he wants it to be something a little bit different than what it is now. I think you could have some good arguments as to, look, was this responsibility best housed in Homeland Security or someplace else? But it's his administration and his rules. On
that point, Jay, it seems to me that we see a regular occurrence is that Donald Trump will want to do something, and he'll say, go do it. And his people will say, that's illegal. We can't do it. Then he'll say, you're fired. I mean, the problem, it seems to me, really isn't the officials.
Welcome to the private sector, Mike.
Well, yeah, I mean, I mean, the problem, right, is that he doesn't have the legal authority to do a lot of what he wants to do. Take this Wednesday, he was in Texas, and he said, he wanted more troops at the border, and apparently more are going to go down there, which he can do. But then he said, our military, don't forget, can't act like a military would act, because if they got a little rough, everybody would go crazy. I mean,
well, he's not wrong, is he?
Well, no, and it would also be illegal, So, yeah, if I just went and broke the law, and then, he's maybe jokingly saying to Border Patrol officials, hey, go ahead and break the law and I'll pardon you if you go to jail. I mean, It was just a joke. But, that it's just. And we, of course, we've seen this with previous presidents as well. But Donald Trump, as with so many other things, takes it to the next level.
Well, here I think this is maybe it's not unique to Trump. It's certainly Trumpian and certainly a characteristic of his, but I wouldn't say it's unique. But there's always this argument of we ought to have business people running the government, and sometimes I'm sympathetic to that argument because sometimes it makes sense. But this is sort of that tension or that again square peg round hole sort of thing when you've got someone who is a CEO of a company who is used to being able to say, I want this to happen, just make it happen.
Right.
Versus someone who's in government, it's just a different animal. There are different constraints. And I think Trump, like a lot of CEOs, often doesn't want to hear, you can't do that. What I think he wants to hear, and this again is this is the way that the private sector tends to work, isn't, they don't want to hear, I can't do that, but they'll, what can I do? Give me a solution.
Sure.
So I think there's some frustration there, and he looks at this as, look, if these guys can't provide me a solution of a way I can fix this problem, I'm going to get rid of them and I'll bring in somebody else and maybe they can.
Well, and I think, though, Jay, that there is a solution, and it's a pretty obvious one. It's to broker some sort of a deal with Congress. And of course, this guy was elected claiming that he has these massive, incredible deal-making capabilities. And yet that seems to be completely off the table. It's like the only people he's interested in talking with are Republicans who agree with exactly what he wants, and he's not interested in bending it all on this. And so there's a solution there. He is just singularly uninterested in pursuing it.
Well, no, I don't know about that. Keep in mind, a couple months ago when we had the shutdown, there was he floated, look, I'll give a limited DACA sort of okay in exchange for wall funding. And Democrats rejected that out of hand. So, I think there's been those attempts to do that. I mean,
I wouldn't say that was
Democratic House also just, recently had a vote, largely symbolic, about allowing illegal immigrants to vote in local elections. So, I think they're completely diametrically opposed, and I'm not sure that, that there's any deal to be had, or maybe at least not yet. And we're finally getting to the point where Democrats are acknowledging that there is a crisis on the border, right? I mean, we had how many months of, well, there's no crisis, it's really not that bad, it's really not a big deal, this is all made up, there's no caravan, there they are. So I think it's maybe he does get it's at some point, but I think both parties really want this issue for the 2020 election. So I just don't think that's going to happen.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't really think that Trump's offer back then that you mentioned was a good faith offer, not along the lines of what, say, George W. Bush tried to do toward the end of his presidency. To me, that was a good faith offer, and there was a real effort made to work across the aisle, and it, of course, blew up.
How'd that turn out? Yeah.
But it was at least a good faith offer, and before you go and do other things, I think it's sort of incumbent on you as the president of the United States to reach out and make a good faith offer. But I mean, I think it's fair to say that there are some Democrats who were late to acknowledge that this is a crisis. Now, that's not to say that Democrats in general say, oh, there's nothing going on here. I mean, there are plenty of Democrats who looked at the numbers and just like me and said, well, yeah, this is a problem and it's a bigger problem and we need to do something about it, So, but yeah, I think that the run up to 2020 makes it difficult to see this sort of thing happen. And of course, should point out that when George W. Bush pushed his immigration deal, that was toward the end of his second term. And so he was in a better position, certainly, to do that than Donald Trump is now, who's understandably worried about immigration. Honestly, well, it's weird. I mean, I guess he does care about immigration, but I don't know if he actually cares about it in and of itself, as opposed to just this is the primary way he can show he is tough and, supports his base and that sort of thing.
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, look, this is the primary issue he campaigned on.
Sure.
And he had a couple big primary, here's the idea, it's a wall. Yeah, I mean, I think he certainly cares about it. And look, there's always sort of some mixed motives in any sort of, public policy, political calculus, right? I mean, it's sort of, look, this is appeals to my base, makes me look tough, and it may be the right thing to do also. So,
Yeah.
and I think he believes it's the right thing to do.
Well, and yeah, I think you're right on that. I guess my concern is that in changing out these folks, he's just bringing in more and more yes people. I mean, you got now it seems like the immigration policy is essentially being run by Stephen Miller, who has made a career out of basically, just trying to own the libs. And he kind of reminds me in a way, Jay, of how I used to be in college, though I grew out of it, and apparently Stephen Miller hasn't yet. But more and more of these people, I think it's important to have voices in there that explain to the president, to give him some differing views of things. And I think Donald Trump, just more than most other presidents, is incredibly uncomfortable with that. And so, he's like the anti-Lincoln in so many ways. There's no team of rivals going on there in the Trump White House.
Well, I think, it remains to be seen who he's going to appoint and who's really going to run.
Tough people. Tough. They're going to be tough.
Well, good.
But that's the problem, is tough is his only move. That's the only thing he knows. He's a one-trick pony, and it's not a very good trick, and it's not going to work.
Well,
because, the law.
Well, and maybe what's going to happen, though, is when you get these tough people in there, they will make a better point and make a better demonstration of why the law needs to change.
I see what you're saying. So kind of Nixon going to China, so we find this so horribly. Yeah. Okay, well, maybe that's an optimistic loss.
I think, because we're probably going to talk about this at some point with my joke at the beginning about Trump saying about, well, we send all these illegal immigrants to sanctuary cities. And on the one hand, that is absolutely a hilarious idea, right?
Right.
But on the other hand, it's one of these. Well, no, exactly. And you say, yeah, you can't just, But to most Americans, it strikes them as, look, you have a bunch of Democrat liberal mayors who say we're not going to enforce the federal laws as to immigration, and we think it's abhorrent what Trump's doing, and don't build a wall. And he's saying, okay, here you go.
Yeah.
He's calling them on it.
But,
and that may lead to the realization of, oh, yeah, there actually is a problem here.
Sure.
And maybe that spurs some more efforts. Again, I think it's going to be really difficult to have anything like that happen during a run-up to a presidential election, but we'll see.
Well, yeah, and from a legal standpoint, I'm sure you'll agree that when government agencies do something, they, of course, have to advance a legitimate governmental objective, and neither spite nor political retaliation are legitimate governmental objectives, right? So, I mean, but
you could do look, you can probably go to those declarations of sanctuary cities, and they probably have all kinds of wonderful whereases clauses, right, and findings in those local ordinances. Saying how important it is that they welcome immigrants and so forth, and you could say, well, look, here's a doesn't have to be a compelling reason, just has to be a rational one. These folks say they really want to have these immigrants here. It's a burden to other places that don't. So I'll go ahead and do it.
Sure, and you could do that to a certain extent. It's as long as there aren't other greater burdens from shipping people a further distance away and so forth and so on. But pretty clearly, Donald Trump's intent is not to make sure that these immigrants are welcomed and comfortable and in communities that are comfortable. He's just trying to stick his finger in the eye of these folks. You know? So,
but also to call out the other side on hypocrisy.
Right, and you actually think that's what he's doing? I think some people are saying, "Oh, come on!" I think that's a naive reading of Donald Trump, or at least a far too kind reading of Donald Trump. Donald Trump is, the famous counterpuncher. He just likes to hit back at people, and he doesn't care if the law or governmental objectives or anything like that. And I think that's the fundamental misunderstanding I think people still make about Donald Trump, that he cares about anything other than Donald Trump. I just don't see any evidence whatsoever that that's the case.
Well, and let's put it this way: he cares about winning.
Yeah,
right?
About Donald Trump winning. Yes, you're right. Absolutely.
And to a certain extent, that translates into he cares about this immigration policy because he cares about Donald Trump winning on immigration.
Okay, on that, yeah, absolutely. So we talked about the sanctuary city thing. The other interesting development this week is that the U.S. District Judge Richard Seaborg in San Francisco enjoined the very, I think, Orwellian named Migrant Protection Protocols policy, under which those applying for asylum could be forced to wait in Mexico while their claims were processed. And I think to this point, that's been applied to around 600 or so folks. And in his opinion, Seaborg wrote that the legal question before him wasn't whether the MPP is a wise, intelligent, or humane policy, or whether it's the best approach for addressing the circumstances the executive branch contends constitute a crisis. His argument was that the MPP most likely violates the Immigration and Nationality Act, the Administrative Procedures Act, and various other protections against immigrants being returned to unduly dangerous situations. And he also wrote, I think it's fairly important, to be clear, the issue in this case is not whether it would be permissible for Congress to authorize DHS to return aliens to Mexico pending final determination as to their admissibility. And this gets to me right into what, we were talking about just a few minutes ago, is that there are solutions here, but you can't just make up your own laws as you go along. The executive authority only goes so far, and after a certain point, hey, Congress has to pass a law. And it seems to me that's exactly what Judge Seaborg's saying.
Yeah, no, and I think Judge Seaborg is right on that. I would, it could go the other way on the, whether this violates the APA or the immigration statutes. But keep in mind, I mean, this has been sort of part of the problem with immigration is that we've got these statutes, and we had either administrations that would refuse to enforce them. In some cases, carte blanche say, I'm just not, with the DACA program.
Right, absolutely.
And then again, the bizarre irony of Trump saying, okay, if Obama can enact this DACA program under the regs, if we have executive authority to do that, I have executive authority to undo it. And courts have differed on that, and that's still playing out. But it's sort of this weird, it's sort of a double standard. I think that, and a lot of Republicans are seeing this, and I think this all plays in Trump's favor, is that, when there's a regulation that is put in place by a Democratic administration, the courts are very much in favor of we need to protect that. If it's a regulation that his administration pushes, or the repeal of a prior regulation, then that's an APA problem or violates the statute. I mean, all this politically plays into Trump's favor, and I think, look, I mean, he had a great week, and if he's, again, I'm no disrespect to the judge, but I think that's sort of the, if the judge is saying, you can't keep him in Mexico, I think Trump may weigh so, well, can we keep him in San Francisco? Well, I mean, I think that's not a bad question to ask, right?
Well, I see what you're saying from the political standpoint, though I want to point out from a policy and a legal perspective, it's if you push the boundaries a lot more, you're going to get turned back a lot more by the courts, and I would argue that the way I see things is Donald Trump is being turned back a lot more because he's trying a lot more radical stuff than previous administrations have. So it's not because Obama judges are turning against Donald Trump out of partisan reason. They're just saying, hey, you're violating the law here, buddy. You can't just do these arbitrary and capricious things.
Yes and no, though, because again, it's one of those. It's not arbitrary and capricious for the Obama administration to pass a rule, but it is arbitrary and capricious for the Trump administration.
That's wrong. It's a false equivalence, Jay. I mean, you're saying you're saying that all of these things that the Obama administration, the Trump administration doing are essentially equal, and so therefore the only reason to rule against them would be because of partisanship, and that's just flat out wrong.
Well, I think I'm not sure why that. I guess I just don't follow why it's
because if you
wrong.
Do something that's if you push the boundaries, but it doesn't go over into arbitrary and capricious, then that should be okay. But if you push over and it is arbitrary and capricious, then and my argument is that it's not because Trump is a conservative, not that he is, but not because Trump is a Republican that these things are being turned down in greater numbers. It's because they're going far beyond the pale a lot more. That's why. I mean, your argument is saying that the courts are just entirely politicized. It seems to me, and I just
no. I'm not making that.
Okay.
I'm not making that argument. Although I would say there is something of a Trump resistance at the district court level, right? And a lot of these get turned around once you get to the appellate court level.
Is it a Trump resistance, or is it a resistance to illegal activity by the president? I mean, regardless of who it would be, there's no way to really answer that question.
A Trump resistance, because as I just said, I mean, look, when the Obama administration says we're simply going to choose not to prosecute under this law, here's our new program. There's that's fine, that's great. When Trump says we are going to prosecute under the laws that are actually on the books, that's arbitrary and capricious.
Well,
So
I mean,
I think that's what I'm saying. I mean, I
think you're painting with a broad brush here. I mean, of course, you find your judge who you think is going to agree with you, and you go to that person. But you point out one instance in the Obama administration, and that actually,
sure.
I agree with you.
Right.
That it was.
That's why I'm pointing that one out. Yeah.
Right, but I'm saying in the Trump administration there are a whole bunch of these things, and so my argument is essentially that Trump has gone a lot further in stretching, and I would argue overstretching, executive authority than say Obama did, and which is why he's getting slapped down by the courts a lot more.
Okay. Although I think he tends to be getting upheld as these things play out.
But he hasn't. I mean,
well, no, he was upheld.
It took 3 tries on the travel ban. I mean, if we take a look at all the times he's been overturned by the courts, it's been a lot more than Obama.
But the travel ban has been upheld.
Right, the third time around, basically.
A travel ban.
Yeah, a travel ban.
Not his original travel ban.
Exactly.
Okay, fair enough.
Exactly.
But he's still got a travel ban.
Well, sure. Yeah, absolutely. He found it right within the law where he could do. He kept on pushing, and finally he found something that the courts would accept. Yeah, exactly. But I guess my question to you is, do you think that Donald Trump pushes the boundaries more than previous presidents, Republican or Democrat?
I don't necessarily know that he does. Legally, no. I mean, he pushes the boundaries, certainly rhetorically.
Okay.
I would say he does. It certainly pushes the boundaries in terms of the norms of what we expect presidents to say and how we expect presidents to act. And he pushes the boundaries in the manner, the alacrity in which he acts.
Okay. Well, let me ask you this then. Let me try to put it into the level of analysis of level of data at least. If I were to show you a comparison of the Trump administration and say the Obama administration in terms of how often they were overturned by appellate courts, and there was a significant difference, meaning that Trump is overturned a lot more, would you take that as evidence that Trump is pushing the boundaries more?
Not necessarily.
So what would be evidence?
It depends.
To you?
It depends on. Well, here's the thing. You can't.
I mean,
I think just saying something like pushing the boundaries. That's a kind of a broad.
Okay, doing more illegal things.
Right?
How about that? I mean, because of course, when the court says you can't do it, it's because it's illegal.
Well,
let me ask you this: Is there any data I could show you? Is there under any circumstances would you be willing to say yes? Donald Trump is doing more things that the courts deem illegal than previous presidents. Because if there's not, then basically you're just arguing from faith and not evidence, and that's why I'm trying to get at this.
Well, if you've got the data, I mean, send it to me.
I'll get the data on that. Absolutely,
send me the data.
I'll absolutely. But my question was, even if I showed you the data, would you just say, "Oh, those liberal courts"?
In some cases, I may, depending on. I'd want to read the opinions. I'd want to read. Who wrote those opinions. I want to see how far along it was in the process, whether it's a district judge, whether it's a appellate court, whether it's an appellate court en banc, or whether it goes to the Supreme Court. Those are all important distinctions.
Okay, yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So, yeah.
Okay, so you're not...
I'll look at the data.
Okay, all right. Well, then I will get
But if I were to send you data
of course.
Showing here's the number of regulatory actions that were taken under the Obama administration, or things done by rule as opposed to by statute, and compare those with other presidencies, would you agree that the Obama administration, provided this is what the data showed, was much more activist in essentially legislating by regulation.
Oh, you have to show
than
me the
prior
data. I have no
administrations.
question about
Oh,
that.
I know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I've seen enough of the data on that to know that is almost certainly the case. Absolutely. Yeah.
Okay.
So my job's going to be harder than your job on this, I guess, because I'm already convinced of that position. So anyway, okay, to be continued. Let's move on. Another big story this week, obviously, is that the attorney general. I want to call him William Barr. I don't know why I want to call him William Barr, but anyway, Barr, I guess Attorney General Barr, just to make it easier for myself, testified before. There must have been a William Barr. Anyway, before the House and Senate this week, ostensibly on budget issues, but really, I mean, it was a lot more about the Mueller investigation. Barr said, first off, of course, that the redacted report would be ready as soon as next week, and that while he could ask for an exception to allow Congress to see grand jury material, he actually wouldn't be doing that. Now, Democrats in Congress could and almost certainly will take legal action to try and have released at least some of what Barr plans to keep redacted. And Barr, in fact, said, "Hey, go ahead and do that. I'm not saying you shouldn't," and so forth. So that was like the smaller of these two issues. And I thought before we got into the spying thing, which I think will take up more of our conversation, Jay, I thought you could maybe talk a little bit about the redaction thing, especially because one of the big reasons for redaction is this grand jury material. And while there is a way to petition a judge to allow at least Congress to see this grand jury material, the Attorney General says he's not going to do it. And so maybe as an attorney, I think you're in a better position than I am to talk about the grand jury functions of it and why we have this stuff redacted and why maybe it would make sense to do so in this specific instance.
Sure. Well, and generally, and again, I don't. My area of practice isn't criminal law, but that doesn't mean I don't know a little bit about grand juries. The idea behind a grand jury is that it can take as much evidence as it can, right? It is an investigatory, essentially, body, and it decides whether there is enough evidence to indict. And for someone to move forward with a prosecution. So the idea behind a grand jury is those proceedings ought to be kept secret unless there is enough evidence to indict, and at which point the evidence that is relevant to the indictment will come out at the trial. It is so that other people are not improperly tarred as being a subject of a criminal investigation if there is no evidence to charge them, or if they just happen to be sort of caught up and sort of wrong place at the wrong time, or somehow associated with this. So that's the reason for one. That's one of the reasons for grand jury secrecy. The other reason for grand jury secrecy is often the grand jury proceedings, and this one doesn't really apply so much here, as far as I know. Typically are going on as the investigation's going on, so that leaks of material that's being presented to the grand jury could compromise the investigation if it got out.
Right.
Those are probably the two big policy reasons, and the courts are pretty jealous in protecting this for a number of reasons. I mean, I guess another reason is people protection of people who testify before the grand jury, right? And again, that may fall, and there may be some issues on something like this if you've got folks who are confidential sources or involved in the intelligence community or something like that.
Right.
For example, and this is completely, I'm completely making this up. I don't know anything. This would just be a complete hypothetical. Say, for example, in the process of investigating whether there is collusion, where there was collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russians, we were to reach out, Mueller was to have reached out to someone who is an American asset in Russia, right? Someone operating secretly, a spy of ours in Russia, and ask, hey, what do you know about this? Have you picked up any intel on, any communications that would point to collusion? That would be a really good reason to have that testimony redacted, not just from a grand jury standpoint, but also from an intelligence standpoint, which are the two big things we're talking about.
Yeah.
So,
And that was the other, the other categories of things seem to be basically around that kind of intelligence, national security. And I get those. But when you were, talking about the grand jury specific things that don't get into intelligence, assets, national security, it seems to me that a lot of them don't necessarily apply nearly as much, at least in this specific instance. And certainly you can argue that there's a strong countervailing instance in Congress, at least having more of this information. So I wonder why then at least there couldn't be some sort of a compromise where some of this grand jury material would be redacted, or maybe the Attorney General just feels like, well, Congress should be the ones to make that case and he shouldn't be. I don't know.
Yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think that's probably the way to do it. And if I'm Barr, I'm saying the exact same thing. Look, this is not a matter of, with the grand jury material, it's not a matter of Barr releases what he sees fit to release. It's up to the court. And Barr's position is essentially, look, if you want to ask the court to release some of this stuff, go ahead, but I'm not going to be the guy to do it.
Right.
And I'm not going to be the guy to go make the argument of why this ought to be released. And if you want to make that argument, you know where the courthouse is. Yeah. So I think that's a pretty reasonable thing. Also, if you look at the reasons why Democrats want this released, and I think it's not being conspiratorial. It would be naive to say otherwise, but these, Washington leaks a whole lot, and the idea would be you find something salacious and you leak it to embarrass someone in one way or another. And Barr would then be able to say, look, this wasn't me.
Yeah, right.
This is on you guys. You're the ones who made the case to the court that it needed to be released, and if it's leaked, we'll know where to look.
Yeah, no, that makes sense to me actually. So let's move on to the bigger issue, because of course we're going to be talking a lot more about the report and redactions and so forth when this comes out.
And again, I think it's also important to at this point, it very much sounds like Barr, everyone is going to redact as much as is feasible, right? As much as possible, and to the extent there is you would err on the side of non-redaction based on what everyone is asking for. So I think we'll get a fairly unredacted report. Obviously I can't tell, but
let's hope so. Yeah, absolutely. So the bigger issue, obviously, from the testimony was that when Barr indicated that he believed that government spying occurred against the Trump campaign and that he planned to look into whether or not surveillance against the campaign was legally permissible. More specifically, he said, I believe there is a basis for my concern, but I'm not going to discuss the basis for my concern. I'm not saying that improper surveillance occurred. I am saying I'm concerned about it and I'm looking into it. That is all. Now, back when Republicans controlled the House, there were two committees that recommended that the Attorney General launch an investigation, and it looks like now that might happen. Of course, I should point out this would be in addition to the investigations on this currently underway by the Justice Department Inspectors General and also apparently by a specially tasked U.S. attorney. Now, in response to all this, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi said, it's dismaying and it's disappointing that the chief law enforcement officer of our country is going off the rails. Now, I disagree with Nancy Pelosi on this.
I was going to say, Barr's statement seems pretty measured, right?
I think it's really the use of the word spying at first, and then he kind of, I think, realized the import of that and kind of not exactly walked it back. But it seems to me, you can't argue that spying, if you want to call it that, or surveillance didn't occur. We know that it occurred, right? So the only real question isn't whether it occurred; it's whether it was legally permissible,
whether it was correctly predicated.
Yeah,
I think was Barr's word.
Yeah, of course you'd want to know that. It seems to me that Barr is right to be concerned, and he's right to look into it, because if this is true, this is incredibly serious stuff. If you have an intelligence community working for partisan purposes against a party's candidate for president, that's huge. And
right, you listening, Scott?
Yeah, I said this from the beginning that the big problem I always had with this beforehand is Well, if the Attorney General, Trump's Attorney General, doesn't even think it's serious enough to look into, how serious could it be? So
Right.
it seems to me that he does. And, of course, he's a partisan and so forth. But I certainly think this is worth looking into. And it's not William Barr going off the rails or anything like that. This is a big deal,
Right.
But I also think it's important to keep in mind that a lot of people on the left saying, "Oh my God, Mike's going off the rails here." But it's important to keep in mind that this was an incredibly unusual set of circumstances. I mean, if you're in the intelligence community, what do you do if you get even a strong hint that it's plausible that the campaign of a major party nominee for the presidency might be working with a hostile foreign power? You don't just say, "Well, that's just a political hot potato. We're going to ignore that." I don't think there's any way to investigate that without ending up without something bad happening. I just don't see it as being possible in a way, even though I think James Comey is kind of an unctuous, kind of holier than thou sort of person. I think he was right in the sense he was put in this kind of impossible situation, and so it's a real tough spot. And in part, I think it's a tough spot because if the Trump campaign really was entirely above board, they would have reported all Russian contacts when they happened and not, it seems like to me, actively sought out dirt from Russian people who may or may not have been connected with the campaign. Maybe that's inexperience, maybe it's carelessness, maybe it's incompetence, but maybe it's acting unethically, at least, if not illegally, though certainly, again, 22 months of investigation, there's clearly not a legal case to be made, but I think there certainly was reason to be concerned and to look into it. And I want to make that clear.
All right. Well, so let's talk though quickly about, I mean, the idea of meeting with the Russians. I think we'll see this when we get more of the Mueller report.
Right.
To the extent to which Trump sought dirt, or to the extent the Russians tried to sell dirt that they perhaps didn't have in the first place. I think you're absolutely right that this is an extremely serious thing. And I think I pointed this out when this first happened, that the whole idea of our intelligence agencies tapping, surveilling a domestic presidential campaign is extremely problematic. Now, as for what else could have been done, I think there's a lot of things you could have done. One would have been when you went to get the FISA warrant, they could have disclosed, "Oh yeah, here are the information we're basing this on. We got from the opponent's, camp." I mean, I think that would have been a good thing to tell the judge. And then apparently they didn't. Other things you could have done would have been notify people within the camp. For example, lawyers, Rudy Giuliani, former federal prosecutor. You could have said, "Hey, we have concerns." And gone to the campaign itself. They've done that in the past, right? They did that with Dianne Feinstein when she had a Chinese spy driving her around.
But that's a good point.
But they didn't show. But I'm saying they didn't show the same respect for Donald Trump and the idea as well, because he must be doing this. But again, to me, you've got to have an awful lot of a pretty strong book of evidence to go. And again, so this is something that there's also consider. We have a couple different systems in our country to surveil people. One is you can get search warrants. You can get, wiretaps and warrants for taps that way. But in order to do that, you go before a regular federal judge,
right.
and you have to essentially show that there's probable cause to issue a search warrant, probable cause that some crime is being committed or is likely to be committed. The FISA warrants are something different, right?
Absolutely.
And it's a different process. And that's what's even a little more troubling, is that, look, if they thought there was a crime, there is a process for that, doing that. This is more to, it's spying, it's counter spying. And there are good reasons to have FISA warrants, because there are times when, look, we would want to intercept foreign communications that don't necessarily have to do with a crime, right? Yeah. We just want them because it's interesting intelligence wise.
Yeah.
And that's part of our intelligence gathering, and that's what states do, like it or not. So I think those are sort of the issues to me that are red flags. Is if you had enough probable cause, why not go to a regular court? Why go to the FISA court? Why not disclose where you got the dossier? All that.
No, and I agree. And here's why I think an investigation by some, and this is the problem, an impartial investigation. Good luck getting anyone to agree on that. But to me, there's this narrative on the right, and there's a great National Review has had some great pieces on it this week. But one that I think just sort of sums up the view on the right is that the author, I forget who it is now, wrote, "How was it that a garbage anti-Trump dossier gathered by an ex-foreign spy from shadowy Russian sources came to set so much of the media narrative about the Russia probe and evidently have an outsized influence on the thinking and actions of the FBI?" And I think that's a great statement, not
Amen,
necessarily
yeah.
of reality, but certainly of the reality as
question.
the right sees it. And that's why I think these investigations can be helpful, is if you can find an arbiter that everyone trusts. Like I think Mueller is, or was certainly, I don't know, but that at least, maybe this is me being naive, that if that comes out, then people can say, oh, okay, I guess it wasn't. And so I think there's certainly a very good possibility that if more of this comes to light, that investigating authorities are going to say, no, there were reasonable grounds to grant that FISA warrant, and it wasn't just all about this Steele dossier and so forth.
Right.
But my concern is that even if that happened, I think obviously, just like with the Mueller report, there's going to be a big segment of the population that's not going to change their mind. And the facts don't matter. It's what I know in my heart to be true matters.
Well, if I'm William Barr, which I would love to be William Barr, or not William Barr, Robert Barr. I just did the same thing.
William Barr. I did say, I don't know. There must be a Robert Barr. Is there a Robert Barr?
No, there was a Bob Barr, who's a congressman from Georgia.
That's why we're doing it, Jay. Yes. Okay, it's William Barr. Yeah. Okay, that explains it.
He has a goofy mustache and.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thank you.
Anyway,
if you're William Barr, go ahead.
I've met Robert Barr. He's a very nice man.
Huh. Okay. Well, there you
go. But anyway, I would love to be William Barr. I would draw as much of my investigation from what's already covered by Mueller.
Yeah.
Now again, I haven't seen the report, so I don't know what's in there, but I think there may well be enough overlap for him to look at, take some of the findings of the Mueller report and weave those into this other investigation. And I think that's what he would do, hopefully, because that would build credibility, or ought to build credibility. But we'll see. And again, those are sort of unknowns that we don't know yet. But I have sort of a feeling that the Mueller report is going to cover some of those issues, and would be able to show how much of a probable cause, to use the criminal term, would have existed.
Yeah, absolutely. So certainly we are not done with this topic by a long shot. There are a lot more things to come, and we'll be having a lot more conversations on it. But until then, before we get to our next story, we want to thank our newest Patreon monthly supporters. There's Jeff, Deborah, and also longtime supporter Dusty recently increased his monthly pledge of support. So thanks, all of you. That really,
thank you, guys.
It means a lot to us. And of course, when you become a monthly sustaining supporter through Patreon, you get more than just Jay and me saying, "Hey, thanks." But that's something. You also get our weekly bonus show, and there are a whole bunch of other things up there on that supporters can get. Just go to patreon.com/politicsguys or politicsguys.com/support, and you can check it all out. Thanks so much. All right, moving on. On Wednesday, the House of Representatives passed legislation that would restore net neutrality. That's, of course, the requirement that internet providers treat all online traffic equally. Now, the measure passed along, mostly party lines. It would have restored through legislation what the FCC mandated by regulation under the Obama administration and then rescinded when Republicans gained the majority on the commission in the Trump administration. Now, this isn't going to go anywhere legally, because Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said the measure was dead on arrival in the Senate. But that doesn't mean that net neutrality is dead necessarily. Now, for those who need that refresher, the ostensible rationale against net neutrality, because it always seems to be bad to be against any neutrality, right? But
I'm against
yeah,
it.
and the rationale is basically that removing this regulatory burden would lead to higher levels of investment in internet infrastructure. And also providers said they had no plans to discriminate. It wouldn't be in their best interest to discriminate. So just kind of trust them on this, that sort of thing. I will point out that, because I have to point out that the FCC chair, Ajit Pai, who kind of led the effort to kill net neutrality, was formerly, wait for it, an attorney for internet provider Verizon. That's probably not coincidental. But anyway, the point being is that there have been dozens of state attorneys general, tech companies, consumer advocacy organizations who actually sued the FCC to stop the net neutrality repeal. And federal court heard arguments on that in February. And we should be getting a decision sometime this summer, but of course that will be, appealed as well. So it's going to be a while. But a number of states actually aren't waiting, and they've passed their own net neutrality protections. And there's one that was adopted in California in 2015. This was challenged in 2018 by the Trump Justice Department in a case that's still pending. So there's a lot going on here, basically, and everything is essentially still kind of up in the air. But Jay, what do you think about this legislation? I mean, you mentioned just very briefly that you're against net neutrality. Why is that?
Well, first of all, as a legislation, I think it's silly, especially if you consider, because we had this conversation 2 years ago.
Yep.
When it happened, and at that point, I made the point that, listen, the net neutrality has been sort of the rule rather than the exception, right? You had no net neutrality throughout the big growth of the internet, the boom years of the mid 90s. Up through about 2015, I think the rules were put in place.
Yeah, 2015.
So, and again, you can tell what a priority this was for the Obama administration, President Obama, elected in 2008, that in 2015 they finally got these passed. And again, it seems that this is a problem in search of a solution. And the cries from the left of this is going to destroy the internet. It's going to stifle all these voices. Well, the net neutrality rules have gone out of effect. They've been out of effect for well over a year. My internet's working fine. People were literally, this is anecdotal, but from what my daughter tells me at her high school, children crying that the internet was going to be going away because of the repeal of net neutrality. And for the most part, I would say most people's experience has not changed whatsoever. And I think it does make sense that, and the other weird thing about this is it's not like this big guy, little guy. It's sort of two big guys. It's the tech companies versus the service providers.
Oh, I disagree. I think there's a big little guy element because under a regime where there's no net neutrality, then smaller startup type firms wouldn't necessarily have the same access to internet fast lanes. Now, you're right that this hasn't come to pass. And I think that's the whole point of the legislation, was to be proactive and make sure that we don't get in a situation where, because now we see a lot more consolidations and so forth, and in both vertical and horizontal consolidations. There's a concern that, why don't we just deal with this before it becomes a problem? And let's recognize the fact on the ground that the internet is essentially a utility at this point, which is how the FCC was able to regulate net neutrality. And so I think you're right that it wasn't a problem. That's why I see that this was good legislation, because it was preventing something from becoming a problem. It's the same reason why you go to the doctor for a physical, or you do preventative medicine sort of things. I mean, that to me is the reason for it, because the system has worked great under what essentially has been net neutrality, because companies haven't done this and will say, well, let's keep it this way. Let's make sure that they don't go in this direction, because you're right, it has been great. My internet's been great. I've been really happy with this, and let's keep it that way.
I'm not even sure how I can even argue against that. But
that's I'm glad to hear that. I know you're.
No, I'm just saying. Look, if this has not been a problem, if that we ought not to wade into legislating things for the very reason that you and I often agree on, unintended consequences. It's not a good idea to wade into passing regulation when there's not a problem
well, weirdly,
solved, or when it seems like as if the problem can be solved by the market or the private sector.
Yeah. And in most cases, I agree with you. But in this case, this is legislation that actually keeps the status quo in place. So it actually is conservative in nature then. So it's a very different thing because it's it's not changing anything. It's just saying we're going to keep it like it's been, basically. So that, I would argue, is a fundamentally conservative piece of legislation. And so Edmund Burke and I are for it. Anyway.
Let me just throw one more piece in, because this was my analogy that I used to try to explain net neutrality. It's essentially that if you say, I have something that I would like, if I'd like to mail you a letter, Mike, old-fashioned wise, I would pay whatever 32 cents postage, and if it would get there in a day or two. Now, if I have something that is really more important that I need to get to you right away, that has to be actual hard copy, I could FedEx it to you, and I could get it to you overnight. I'd pay substantially more, but I would know that you would get it overnight. And people seem to understand that makes sense. Also would be, look, if I'm sending you a letter or a package in FedEx, that's one thing. It's quite another if I'm going to ship you a piece of furniture. That's going to take a lot more resources to move and to ship, and therefore you ought to be able to charge a higher price for it. And that's sort of what the anti-net neutrality folks are saying. Look, if you are one of these large internet users, and it's mostly you're talking your Netflixes and streaming services, we ought to be able to charge a higher price to deliver those bigger packages, those bigger pieces of furniture than we do just for some guys who's writing a blog in his basement.
Well, and I think that's a great analogy, and it works awesome in the 20th century. But I would argue that electronic communication is, for reasons that we probably won't have time to get into, is just fundamentally different. And so that kind of 20th century analogy of shipping physical things from point A to point B just doesn't really hold up very well.
It's still the amount of data you have to send over the same conduit. And the great thing is, if you can monetize this and you can charge more to some of these streaming people, Netflix, now Disney, who wouldn't want to charge more to Disney? And what you're going to get is more investment in high-speed internet, as opposed to. And I think we could go on and make a big argument about the way the phone systems were set up as utilities before the Bell breakup. That how much further might we be along communication wise if we hadn't had those regulations kind of hamstringing us back then. Right. But that's for another day.
Yeah, and I certainly agree in that case. But yeah, you're right. Probably for another day. Anyway, moving along, WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange was expelled from the Ecuadorian embassy in London this week and then arrested by British law enforcement in connection with a U.S. indictment for conspiracy to hack into a government computer system. Now, this single count indictment is considered to be, by a lot of legal experts, to be a way to charge him that avoids those kind of very difficult freedom of the press issues. Now,
right.
He'll still have the opportunity to fight extradition, and this process is almost certain to drag on for a good period of time. And it seems like there were two basic factors behind his expulsion from the embassy. Number one, a change to a more moderate U.S.-friendly government in Ecuador, because it was a leftist Ecuadorian president who kind of wanted to make a stand, make a stand against the U.S. that, who gave him that in the first place. And also, and I guess this is no small thing, according to some reports, that Assange was a horrible house guest. Did this not strike you as bizarre, Jay? If you're there just by the sufferance of this country and you're going to be arrested, do you blast music at 1:30 in the morning, abuse the staff, and apparently even spread excrement on the grounds? Yeah. What are you thinking? It sounds like somebody with mental problems, serious.
Well, I think Julian Assange may well have mental problems.
But to me, the other part of this interesting is, the Russian government, of course, decried what they called an attack on press freedom, which it seems laughable from a country where, opposition journalists wind up, threatened, beat up, and killed, right? And then Edward Snowden, safe and secure in Moscow, was similarly outraged. And I learned, I don't know if you knew this, Jay, but it turns out the Guardian at least reports that there was a plan to have Assange join Snowden as kind of a guest of that, famous protector of the First Amendment, Vladimir Putin. Apparently, Russian operatives had put together this plan to exfiltrate him from the embassy and kind of spirit him away to Russia, but they abandoned it as being just a little bit too risky, low chance of success kind of thing. But what do you think, Jay? I mean, is Assange a journalist who's being unjustly persecuted for daring to challenge the national security state, or is it more like Senator Mark Warner called him, a direct participant in Russian efforts to undermine the West and a dedicated accomplice in efforts to undermine American security, or Mike Pompeo being a little more succinct, calling him the leader of a non-state hostile intelligence service? So what do you think?
Well, I think, the two people you quoted there, I think are correct. Although I think they maybe give him too much credit. Okay. Right. I mean, I think he's more a guy who's got some bizarre narcissistic kind of God complex.
Yeah, I think everyone can agree on that. Yeah.
You know what I mean? And I think he's just nuts. And again, to say he is working for the Russians, I certainly think he is aiding them, whether he's doing it intentionally or just out of his own sort of bizarre worldview. I don't know, but I think it's good that he is being indicted. The U.S. is probably going to have to get in line. I know there's also Sweden wants to indict on rape charges. I think there's other British charges against him.
There's certainly in Britain. I know that the jumping bail by going to the embassy. I believe. I think the sex charge in Sweden might have been dropped, I believe. But I mean, it's difficult because
sort of stayed because they couldn't prosecute because he's in the Ecuadorian embassy.
But, to me, on is he a journalist or not? I think I have to come down and saying he's just an incredibly irresponsible journalist. So and this is a tough call, certainly, and responsible journalists don't just release sensitive national security information that can get people killed. They vet these things, and he clearly seemed to have no concern for that. So I think he's a wildly irresponsible journalist, and sometimes he doesn't act like a journalist. But of course, here he's not being charged, as a journalist. Exactly, he's being charged for that, which kind of seems like a ticky-tack charge of computer hacking. But I believe I looked at the statute, and I think there's a prison term for that, anywhere between 10 and 20 years, depending on what the charge is exactly. So if anyone needs to be out of public circulation, boy, this guy sure seems to be. And it's interesting to see the partisan back and forth, because he's been alternately a hero to both the left and the right, depending on who he's helping out.
I don't know if you'd say he's been a hero to the right. He's been a hero to Trump occasionally.
Yeah, the I love WikiLeaks kind of thing. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to paint him as a heroic figure. Certainly, I would say, if anything else. So there's an article that one of the articles I read before this week. Julian Assange got what he deserved, and that seems to me about kind of how I feel about this whole case. But do you think he's going to end up? I mean, extradited and serving time? What's your sense?
I think so. After a while, I mean, it's gonna take a while. But I don't. I think there's a very weird dynamic that in fact that Trump said I love WikiLeaks now means that the left will no longer defend Julian Assange, which is probably good, and it sort of all works out.
I mean, and there are still some people on the left. I mean, The Intercept is a big Glenn Greenwald and those folks who basically, it's that old Gore Vidal thing about it's all the national security state and we just need to unmask this whole thing. And in fact, that's, the book that Assange was holding when he was arrested and that sort of thing. And I don't think that some of those people are completely nuts, but there are some of them who I think take it to a pretty extreme level, I would say.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah. All right. Well, I think that about does it for this week. Well, though, of course, if you are a Patreon supporter, as soon as we are done with this, Jay and I are going to be recording the bonus show. And at least I know one of the things we're going to be talking about, very fitting, is why Congress isn't interested in making it easier for you to file your tax returns. So there's that. And there have been some other things we'll talk about as well. So if you're a supporter, that should be in your app by the time you hear this. And if you're not yet a supporter, again, go to our Patreon page, patreon.com/politicsguys, or just go to politicsguys.com/support. Also, if you could subscribe to the show, that really helps us out, as does sharing episodes. Let people know what you think about the show, especially if it's good, probably not if you think it sucks, But anyway, leaving ratings, review on iTunes or whatever podcast app you happen to be using also really does help. The executive producers of the Politics Guys are Michael Baranowski, Jay Carson, Bruce Johnson, Wilmer Moreno, and Benji Fishman. Today's show was produced by me, Michael Baranowski. We'll be back with the new show on Wednesday. We hope you join us.